So, Jonathan, it's great to see you today.
Fantastic to see you, Jason.
So, Jonathan, you got one of the largest YouTube channels covering the war in Ukraine, and you've been following Ukraine and Russia for years and years now. So, let me ask you, what do you think is going to happen next? Can you imagine Putin surviving this war? Do you think that post-war Russia will still have Putin as a dictator?
I think the war continues and continues at this scale precisely because Putin understands that without war, his regime is at an end. Um, I think at this point, he has doubled down on Ukraine to such an extent and invested so much of his own personal, I would say, capital into it, that it would be a deep humiliation to lose the Donbass, and it would be even worse to lose Crimea. So when these things happen, I'm confident they will eventually happen. I doubt whether his personal regime will survive that. And indeed, the question then needs to be asked, how much more resource, how many more people will he throw into this war in order to just keep it burning on and on for the preservation of his own skin, frankly?
So that's a good question. What do you think he'll do? Do you think he'll just continue this war forever and ever? Or I have a hypothesis, which is that he will only stop when he is stopped. And he will be stopped by one of different factors. There'll be a political factor, such as a Prigozhin moment, where all of a sudden somebody comes and tries to remove him from power. Now, there could be a military moment where his military collapses for whatever reason, which historically has happened. But there's one reason that militaries have collapsed historically, and that's a third reason, which I think is the most likely reason, which is economic. Something like hyperinflation can rack an army and totally destroy it. So all of a sudden, soldiers run out of weapons, but also their salaries no longer have any real value. So is it really worth fighting for? So going ahead, I think the Russian economy is on such a very unlevel footing at this point, in such a very dangerous situation, especially considering that the US may soon slap on new sanctions that would go after countries like India and China that buy Russian oil. Keep in mind, Russian oil is about 38% of the Russian budget. China and India combined make up about 80% of purchases from Russia. But what do you think? How do you see that playing out?
I think that is going to happen eventually. Eventually, enough pressure will build up on the Russian economy. The trouble is, in the kind of drip feeding way it's being carried out, we have given the space not only for Russia to learn militarily and learn from its mistakes. We should have studied history and understood that that unfortunately is what Russia does. It makes mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. Eventually, it starts learning, and that's a very dangerous point for its adversaries. We've drip fed it to the point where Putin's regime has become far more toxic. So rather than a sort of full dose of antibiotics, Biden's been giving half doses. In fact, the whole West has been given half doses of medicine. This has made the disease far more virulent, but not killed it off. So that's unfortunate. And even now, we are not taking the measures at the required scale and speed. There are many things that could be done. There are some things that will be done eventually, but they could have been done a year ago, 2 years ago, even right at the start of the full-scale war. And we may already have seen a conclusion of this. So, yes, I agree. There's almost an inevitable point where the Russian economy does experience some form of collapse, even under a sort of central command militarized economy that we're currently seeing. But we need to hasten that point. We need to get there faster. And unfortunately, we are still dithering along.
Tragically, I fully agree with you. So, a lot of people, though, are afraid. They say if we go full out and we really put pressure on Putin, let's imagine that his regime falls. Somebody even worse than Putin is likely to take power. Now, I reject the hypothesis, but what do you think?
I think both historically, but also in terms of the tone of that argument, it is a thoughtless argument. And it kind of irritates me when I hear that because people who often say that have no understanding whatsoever of how not just Russian regimes work and historically how these things have happened. They have no real idea of how other historical processes have kind of wound out. And Ukrainians are rightly outraged at that, worse than what they would argue. Worse than hundreds of shaheeds coming over nightly, worse than the children being massacred, worse than the torture of POWs and the rape of civilians. No, no, for Ukrainians, there is little worse than Putin. But also historically, we see that when a dictator, someone who has gathered so much power, personal power, into a single place, which since the time of the Tsars, actually, you have to go back a long way in Russian history to find a point where there was so little collective governance that it's all in the hands of one capricious, prejudiced, narrow-minded thug like Putin. You have to go back to the latter days of Stalin to actually see something like that. We see that when that tyrant falls, there is a period of consolidation that can last years, if not decades, where whoever takes over, and we're not talking about a Democrat here, we're talking about another would-be tyrant. It takes them a long time to reconsolidate that power and authority. At this point, we should be grateful for such an opportunity where Russia turns in on itself, because when they are trying to entrench or consolidate their regime, it means they're not invading anybody. And there are plenty of examples in history where this has happened. In the first years of when he finally managed to come out of the shadows and take control of the Communist Party. Stalin didn't go on foreign adventures. It wasn't until the sort of 40s and the grand pact made with the Nazis to essentially carve up Poland and by implication Europe. But it took a long time to get to that point, more than a decade. I think we need to bear that in mind. It's not going to be a nice character because you cannot be a nice character at the top of that power vertical. It's going to be potentially another real kind of scumbag. But actually, that's a breathing space that we need right now.
It's definitely going to be better than what we currently have. And I fully agree with you. I think it's sort of preposterous to say it'll be worse than Putin. Worse than what? The man's committing genocide. He's committing war within the center of Europe. He threatens nuclear war regularly through his proxies, even. This man is a mess. It is the worst that could happen to say, but it could be worse. You know who really benefits from that line? Vladimir Putin benefits from that line because
Yes,
it
it
makes
does.
him sound like
Yeah.
the rational actor and the one that we should prefer than the unknown. But history proves the opposite. The fact
And
is,
he is not behaving
no,
particularly
he's not.
rationally, even
He's not a
within his
rational
own
actor.
framework. No.
Exactly. We're getting a rough deal here. If anyone thinks that we're getting a good deal with Putin, they haven't seen how bad it could get yet. That doesn't make sense. No, the guy is a disaster for us. And the sooner he falls from power, the better off it is for absolutely everybody. But let me ask you just one last
I
question.
mean,
What do you,
just a
yeah,
little point on that one, Jason. I mean, you probably follow the work of Vitaly Portnikov, and he has, I think, a brilliant explanation. He says you have to stop seeing Russia as a state governed by someone who deserves respect as a statesman. He calls it the Hezbollah of the snow. It is essentially behaving like Al Qaeda. It's a terrorist organization at this point, and of course the scale of mayhem that could be unleashed through outsourcing of terror operations, assassination, sabotage, etc. We haven't even begun to contemplate what Putin is actually capable of when he is further cornered.
I fully agree with you. I mean, let's look at this just objectively. There's a reason that they're very similar to Hezbollah. Russia has states with which allies, obviously, such as Iran, such as North Korea, which both way are both under sanctions for reasons such as terrorism. But there's other countries like Venezuela. And the reason that Venezuela is under sanctions is that it's a drug cartel. It's for the exportation of cocaine specifically. But you know with whom it works to do that? To wash the money, Hamas and Hezbollah are both involved. In fact, last week the White House came out with a statement about trying to track money in Latin America tied to Hezbollah because Latin America, in the tri-state area specifically, is the largest hub for washing money for Hezbollah. But guess with which other embassies they work? Now we know Nicaragua is involved. We know that Cuba is involved. And guess what? Sure enough, the Russians are involved. We know that the Russians are involved in other countries like Burkina Faso, such as Niger, et cetera, et cetera. And why is all this? Well, it's a global network. And why it's global networks is very simple, right? We have states that are sanctioned, so they can't do business. They don't have access to normal monetary instruments. But you also have organizations, whether it's Hezbollah or if it's a drug cartel, that have if needs for accessing monetary instruments or banks, and they cannot do so. But guess who has a lot of cash? Drug cartels. And guess who's got access to banks? Russia and Iran. So all these things work together. There is a global enterprise that's working against our national security interest. And the fact is, they're just a bunch of thugs working together. And unfortunately, we give them the decency of treating them as states. And they love the fact that they receive the diplomacy, being treated as equals. And they know that they are gaming the system. And that's what Russia is. It's gaming the system against us.
And this is why the idea of radical fragmentation of Russia should be an attractive one, not something that we fear, because how do you break up one of the, if not the largest sort of cartel in history, the largest mafia grouping, which is essentially the Russian state run by the
Mm.
FSB, which essentially in the 90s, late 90s, merged with the mafia groupings to become essentially a state-run mafia operation. Well, you divide and conquer, you break it into smaller units, you try to instill or encourage sort of democratic forces in those smaller units because they're not going to happen at the level of an empire. They're not going to happen at the level statewide as it currently exists in Russia. No, you deprive that central mafia head of the resources it needs to continue its operations, and you divide and conquer by breaking it and helping to fragment it into multiple pieces. And then you do the hard work of dealing with those multiple pieces, trying to chop off the smaller heads of the Hydra. And yeah, lots of little small heads will pop up in its place, but you just keep going and going and going. But you have no chance while it is a large imperial entity. And you will not have, I would say, the cooperation and support of the population at large because they are still coerced and controlled as long as Russia remains a unitary, singular mafia empire state.
Absolutely the case. The more that we could do now to defeat the Russian imperialism that exists or to defeat its leader, Vladimir Putin, the better off is for everyone. And that's why the war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's in the global interest of everybody here to defeat this imperialist regime that's waging war against us already globally. Jonathan, it's great talking with you today.
Fantastic speaking again, Jason. Thank you.